tuning into the Short Stacks. I'm Lisa Quintero, young adult librarian.
And I'm Nick Barron, patron and sometimes volunteer.
This is a show where we talk to you about what we've been reading, listening to, or watching. But first,
library news.
So we've got quite a few events coming up. The last of the Do Black Lives Matter series with Reggie Jackson is going to be taking place on Tuesday, February 9th at 6 p.m. And that one is going to be covering the devaluation of Black lives in the criminal justice system. I've been able to attend the previous 3 sessions, and they've all been great so far. Nick actually has been able to attend a couple of them with me, too.
Yep, they've been fantastic. We can talk more about that in a minute.
Yeah. And on that day, also in the morning, we have Rhyme Time Tuesday online with Miss Heidi, and there will be a family fun night to go kit. So we have a table right outside of the youth services department right now where you can pick up kits, whether they're adult kits, teen kits, kids kits. They're all in one area, so you don't have to go around looking for them. And so keep an eye out for that there. And then on Wednesday the 10th, there will be an art cart to go as normal, as well as on Wednesday the 17th. And then on Thursday the 18th, there'll be a story time online with Miss Heidi at 9 a.m. And then at 11 a.m., we'll have the Adult AM Book Club, and they are, I believe, are reading Death Stalks Door County by Patricia Sculp. Then on Friday the 19th, we're going to have our next grown-up take and make kit. And that, it looks like, is going to be a small macrame project. So yeah, what have you thought about the Reggie Jackson program so far?
So I caught the last 2, and
yeah, the last one was on the devaluation of Black lives in medicine, and then the one previous to that was on the devaluation of Black lives in law.
Yes, and both programs were fantastic. Reggie Jackson is incredibly knowledgeable, as one would expect, but some of the material overlapped with things that I've seen, like watching documentaries like 13th and things like that. But some of the information, and also with the Black Lives and Medicine, it covered some of the same ground that there was an episode of John Oliver last year that covered medicine and Black lives.
Okay.
That was a really good episode. But one of the things about taking in information from like John Oliver is that when you take in information from somebody like John Oliver, there's comedy interspersed in there. And that it allows you to not get overwhelmed by the material, but at the same time, it takes some of the gravity away.
Yeah.
Whereas I feel like, getting information from someone as knowledgeable as Reggie Jackson, and that has an emotional connection to the material that's being discussed, it has much greater weight. And I hearing some of the same facts over again, and having it come from a different source, it just reinforces how grave the situation is.
Yeah, no, I agree, because I think, I don't remember that episode particularly of John Oliver, but I do, watch John Oliver and watch Trevor Noah and watch those comedy news shows, and I do think that sometimes that takes away from the gravity. And sometimes, we need that, because sometimes I feel like everything's just so heavy. But at the same time, sometimes we need to understand how heavy things are in order for anything to change.
Yeah.
And so, I've enjoyed them a lot too. I've learned a lot of things that I feel like we should be learning that I feel like I should have learned at least in elementary and high school, but I did not. I know a lot of other participants in the comments have commented that as well. And I just hope that future generations get to learn some of this stuff at younger ages than we have.
The fact that so many of the things that are covered, which are well documented in history, are just buried. Buried in the school system doesn't cover those things, and it's a tragedy because it just results in a populace that glosses over all of the tragedy that was inflicted upon Black folks and other peoples as well.
Yeah. And I understand that the schools can only do so much because you have to cram so much material into a short amount of time, but I think that it's worthwhile to have students learn things about racial justice and social justice earlier on in their academic careers. And I'm hoping that more people do that in the coming years, and I feel like we try to help with that at the library by doing things like I mentioned, we're doing the Read Woke program, trying to get people to read from voices other than their own, trying to get people to explore ideas other than what they might be regularly exposed to, and what the status quo is and what society teaches us. So, because I think the more that we learn about other people's ideas and the more that we hear other people's stories, the more empathetic we are, and the more we understand why people are asking for change, why we need change, what kind of changes we need. So yeah, I if you haven't attended any of the sessions, I recommend that you sign up for the last one. You just have to sign up on the Shorewood Library calendar, which is at shorewoodlibrary.org, and you click on the link and then you register for the Zoom meeting.
And one of the things that I also want to throw in is that one thing that does give me hope, because like we just glossed over the concept of the devaluation of Black lives in medicine. Basically, that program, a lot of it talked about how for Black folks, a lot of medical testing and things was done on them, in some cases unbeknownst to them, in some cases, as a financial incentive. And it's a really sad and terrifying state of affairs. And it covered all the way up to things happening as late as like 1995. Mm-hmm. And so this is a thing that has consistently happened throughout U.S. history in regards to Black folks and medicine. But one of the things that brings me hope is the fact that, Shorewood Library is a small library. There was 100 at peak attendance. There was 175 people at the one. And some of the people were, because Shorewood Public Library worldwide. Some
people are tuning in from outside of Wisconsin or outside of the village of Shorewood. Yeah. But some people may even be tuning in from outside of the country. But I think, the more people that are exposed to these ideas, the more chance, we have to educate people and to potentially bring about some positive changes for people who have faced a lot of discrimination and a lot of oppression over the years. Yeah, for sure. So the takeaways from this, definitely check out the next Reggie Jackson thing, which is, again, on February 9th at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. But also, if you don't have a chance to catch Reggie Jackson somewhere, participate in Read Woke, or, even track down that John Oliver episode. You can find it on YouTube. Yeah, and he mentioned a few documentaries that I'll mention after this next bit, but I just wanted to talk about the Wi-Fi hotspots that I mentioned on the podcast earlier. We actually have launched them. We launched them on February 1st, so if you are interested in checking out a Wi-Fi hotspot, you can do that at the library now. You just have to go to the front desk, and you get it for 3 weeks. So you just need a Milwaukee County Library card in good standing, and you can go ahead and check one of those out and have free internet at home for 3 weeks, and then bring it back and somebody else gets a chance at it. So just wanted to share that.
From the stacks.
So last week we said that we were going to talk about Ready Player One this week. So unfortunately...
Ready Player Two.
I keep calling it Ready Player One, yes. Okay. We said we were going to be talking about Ready Player 2 by Ernest Cline this week, but we are not going to be talking about Ready Player 2.
Because we're only 3.5 hours in.
Into the audiobook, yes. Yeah. Because we were listening to it, because like we said, we wanted to listen to it narrated by Will Wheaton. And so this week instead we're going to be talking to you about some movies, and we are planning on listening to the rest of Ready Player 2 this weekend. So next episode we should be able to talk about Ready Player 2 and Star Trek Discovery, like we mentioned last time as well.
Oh, did we say that?
We did say that.
Oh man, I've got so many feelings.
Yes, you said you were going to share all your hot takes. But we're going to have to save those for the next episode. So instead, this week we are going to talk about 2 movies that we saw recently that were Music Box Film productions, and then we're going to talk about a PBS documentary that we watched. So if you're looking for, as this cold spell hits this week, these frigid temperatures, and you want to do something cozy inside, movies are great cozy inside activities. Make yourself some hot cocoa or some tea or something and cuddle up on the couch with some blankets in a movie. So the first one I want to talk about is we watched Nomad, which is a Werner Herzog film, and it's a documentary. It's the Bruce Chatwin story. And so Bruce Chatwin was a friend of Werner Herzog's, and he was a man who liked to study different cultures and traveled all over the world. And they met, I believe he said they met in South America?
I don't remember.
Yeah, I believe he said they met, I think, when Werner Herzog was filming a film in South America. And I think Bruce Chatwin was on the search of this giant sloth that he thought was a dinosaur because some relative of his had sent a piece of skin back to England or Wales, and said that it was a dinosaur skin, but it turned out to be this piece of skin from this giant sloth down in, is it Chile? It was somewhere in South America.
So I think we're getting too. First, we should set up Werner Herzog himself.
Okay.
Because if you've never seen a Werner Herzog movie, Werner Herzog just has a very unique way of looking at the world. If you don't know Werner Herzog's name and you've never seen any of his movies, the only context that you might have is if you watched this first season of The Mandalorian. He was one of the Imperial officers, and he's just this older gentleman with like a thick like Austrian accent.
Yeah, so he's German. He's from Bavaria.
Okay.
And he has been making films since the 1960s, and he started mostly making films in Germany, and he worked a lot with Klaus Kinski, who is a European actor, and they were notorious for their relationship because they had this very volatile relationship where Herzog was the director, Kinski was the star of a bunch of his movies, and Kinski would just like fly off the handle all the time and like punch people and punch Werner Herzog, and like just like there's these crazy stories. Like if you watch interviews with Werner Herzog, he'll talk about it, and yeah. So I've never seen any of the films with Klaus Kinski, and I want to because I think I've only seen one or two of his fiction films.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the films that I've seen of his are documentaries, and I've really enjoyed all the documentaries because, like Nick says, he's very observant, and he has a very unique take on the world, and just looks at the world with this wonder of like a child.
Yeah.
So other films of his that you might be familiar with are he did Grizzly Man, which was about a man who lived among grizzly bears and ended up ultimately getting killed by a grizzly bear. But this man, thought that he had become one with the grizzlies, and it was a documentary about him. He also did Encounters at the End of the World, which is about Antarctica and people who work and live in Antarctica, which was very interesting. He did a documentary called Lo and Behold, which was about technology and how it's kind of taken over our lives, and what technological advances have been made in terms of like self-driving cars and robots in Japan that are being used to take care of elderly people, and all sorts of different ways in which we are using technology nowadays, and what that means for humanity. And he looks at a lot of the deep philosophical questions in all of his films. And so this film felt like a very personal film for him. So Bruce Chatwin was a travel writer, and like I said, he traveled all over the world, and he met Werner Herzog at some point, and they became friends because they both had a very similar way of looking at the world. Because from what it sounds like, Bruce Chatwin was equally imaginative, liked to share just as many stories, and looked at the world also with eyes of childish wonder, the way that Herzog does. And so it was interesting watching it because we've watched so many of his other documentaries. And in the other documentaries, you can tell that he doesn't have, he has interest in it, but it's not something that emotionally affects him. Because one thing that I found a little irritating in this film is that sometimes it seemed like he was leading the people that he was interviewing and trying to get them to say certain things about Bruce that he might feel himself personally, but maybe they didn't feel. And so that in that way you could tell that it was a very, very hard thing for him to do because this was his close friend. And Bruce Chatwin died from AIDS several years ago, and so part of it was this tribute that he wanted to do for his friend. And he talked about how his friend gave him this knapsack that he's taken with him all over the world on all of his travels, and how it's this piece of Bruce that he carries with him. So it's a very, very touching film. But yeah, I found it a little frustrating when he was like leading people in questions, being like, he was like this, right?
I think that was a flaw to the movie, but so Bruce Chatwin was a perpetual traveler, and so that's why the movie is named Nomad. And so it talked about his travels and some of the things that he that he did and the explorations that he did in like Australia and South America and in Africa.
And one thing that they both agreed on, and part of why it's called Nomad, is because they both agreed that traveling on foot is like the best way to see and get to know a place.
Yeah.
And Bruce Chatwin traveled on foot through various places like Australia. And Werner Herzog actually wrote a book about his travel in the 1970s, I believe it was. It's called Of Walking on Ice, and it's available through the library system, and it's a pretty interesting book because it's written the way that he thinks. It's like a diary, basically, of his travel, and he walked from his home in Germany all the way to France, I believe, because he had another friend who was sick and dying. And so, yeah, it kind of chronicles him traveling through all this farm country and meeting locals and talking to people, and then, you know, kind of what he felt like as he was walking out after days and days of walking through farms and not seeing anybody. But he says that, like, he feels like the best way to travel is to travel on foot because you get to experience more by traveling on foot.
Yep. So yeah, it was an interesting movie. While Lisa was talking, I was trying to look up to see if it was real, but because I was going to read this Yelp review of Trader Joe's that is supposedly attributed to Werner Herzog. But
it's real. He's read it. He's read it.
I thought I was because I thought it was fake.
He wrote it, and then there's also a recording of him reading it.
Yes.
Like a video of him reading his own Yelp review about Trader Joe's. Are you going to read it?
Yeah. So to get
you have to think about it in the Bavarian voice. You
yes.
gotta need like an accent like Arnold Schwarzenegger.
But to give it context, give Werner Herzog context. This is his review of going to Trader Joe's. Madness reigns. The first challenge your soul must endure is the parking lot. You wait with your vehicle, half blocking traffic, creating a perfect circular vortex of anger that encompasses the street and the entrance to the store. Once you attain access to the lot, you discover that this is a false achievement. Other motorists stop and start with no thought or plan. Turns once begun are quickly abandoned, the drivers seemingly immune to geometry. This is just, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but it gives you a sense of how he frames things when he's narrating.
Mm-hmm.
He just, even something as mundane as trying to park at Trader Joe's just has a certain level of drama.
Yes.
That is just very entertaining.
Indeed.
So
that is Nomad, a Bruce Chatwin story, and it is available through the library, and that was one of the Music Box film productions that we saw. And then the next Music Box film production that we saw was called Beats. And we actually saw the trailer for it when we watched Nomad. We saw a few trailers for movies that we wanted to watch when we watched Nomad. And Beats was one of them, and it was about these kids in, was it Scotland? It was somewhere in the UK.
Yeah.
And it takes place during the 1990s, and apparently the UK banned music with repetitive beats during the time. And so basically any electronica or house music was illegal.
So essentially what they were trying, what the government in that part of the UK, or possibly in all the UK, was trying to do was trying to stop the existence of raves. Mm-hmm. Because raves, if you're not familiar with rave culture, essentially they would go to an abandoned warehouse, advertise, and have a bunch of people show up, and they'd have set up a sound system, and people would just do a lot of drugs and dance. And so,
which is what the hippies did at Woodstock. So I don't know what the problem is, but anyway.
Yeah. So, but in order to crack down on this occurrence, maybe it was because it wasn't in an open field and it was in a warehouse.
Maybe, I don't know.
But yeah, so in order to crack down on this, they created a law specifically having to do with music with repetitive beats. And so the movie takes the concept of this law. And it's not a documentary. It's about kind of like a coming of age story of sorts, because it's about two teens that are in love with rave music, with techno, and they're just discovering it. And one of them is in a in a family that is trying to like come up out of poverty and that looks down upon the other people that live in the neighborhood that they are currently in.
Yeah, his mom, you can tell that kid's mom was a single mom, and she's now dating a new man, and the man wants to move them out of the neighborhood, and it turns out we find out that the man is a police officer, and then the kid's best friend is lives with his older brother. We don't see any parents in the picture, and his older brother is like a local crime guy, like
a local drug dealer.
Yeah, he's a drug dealer, but he also like beats people up, and like nobody wants to mess with him, and he's known as being a bad influence. And so the cop dad, stepdad, like doesn't want the kid hanging out with his best friend, but they've been hanging out since they were little kids, and so you get the vibe that they've been hanging out since they were little kids, and that they've always been there for each other. And so it's kind of about those transitions that we have in our like teen years of trying to do the things that we want to do, but at the same time trying to make our parents happy. And so, there's a little bit of teenage rebellion that happens in the film because him and his friend want to go to a rave, and his stepdad catches them. They're all at all these cars are parked in this area, and they're all listening to electronica. And the cops show up and break up this gathering of people because they're like, you're not supposed to be here. You can't be listening to this kind of music. And this underground radio station is planning a big rave, and so they're like giving out these secret codes of how you're going to get here.
Yeah, they keep saying, it's funny because the one kid walks around with a radio like 24/7 for a section of the movie, and it's because he's waiting for information about when the next rave is going to come.
Yeah, because they keep dropping clues, but they don't drop all the clues at once.
Well, it's because they don't want to announce the actual location.
Yeah, so the police officers don't show up and break it up.
Yeah, so they were trying to you eventually get to know the DJ and what have you, the organizer, and so you understand later that it's because they've got nothing set in stone until like the last minute, and then they're like, we're showing up at this time with the sound system, and things are gonna go. But yeah, it was so. Even though I know I talk about punk and metal a lot, in the 90s. I definitely, even though I didn't go to raves or get involved in rave culture, I did really like techno music. Things like, Prodigy, Crystal Method, Chemical Brothers, things like that. And the movie won the DIY ethos that goes along with rave culture is something that I really enjoy. And then most of the soundtrack is from the first Prodigy record, and it's great.
Yeah, I found it relatable in that way because, you and I both came up in the DIY punk scene and, setting up shows in people's basements or generator shows under a bridge at a park is not uncommon, and it's a lot of you find out where it's happening based on your friends and word of mouth, and it's not something that's posted up publicly because, oftentimes police will shut those things down, and so...
Yeah, and one of the things that also was really relatable is that when I was a teenager, there were two different instances of shows that I attended where it got broken up by the police, and the police came in and started swinging billy clubs at teenagers. And that's something that also takes place in the movie. So yeah, it was a very relatable movie, even though it takes place in England and is about a scene that I was not directly involved in, but at the same time, it had a lot of relatable themes.
Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot, and I really enjoy coming of age stories, so I enjoy that aspect of it as well.
Yeah.
And then the last movie that we're going to talk to you about is another documentary. So like Nick said, Beats is not a documentary; it's just a feature film. Nomad was a documentary, and this one is a documentary. It's not a Music Box film. It was a PBS production called And She Could Be Next, and it's a 2-part series, and it was done in, I believe, 2018 was the year it came out, because it was done around the time that Stacey Abrams was running for governor of Georgia, and it covers and
Rashida Tlaib being elected the first time.
Yeah, and so it covers several women from all over the country and their process of trying to get elected and kind of what they've had to go through in order to get on the ballot and get their name out there and everything. And so yeah, it covers some well-known women like Stacey Abrams and Rashida Tlaib, but also some lesser-known people. Like there was a young woman in the suburbs of Chicago who was running for something with a county, like some county position, and she was a 19-year-old young woman that was going to DePaul University who decided she wanted to get involved in public service. And so it kind of follows them along and kind of follows what they're trying to accomplish with their public service, why they went into public service, their trajectory through public service, because some of them Congress people, like one of the Congress people that they follow is a woman whose son was murdered in when he was listening to music in his car in a gas station, and she ran for government in Georgia because she wanted more stricter laws for gun.
She was trying to restrict gun use to a certain extent.
Yeah, and so she banded together with a lot of parents who've been active with the school shooting movement and all that stuff, and so it follows her and her campaign. It follows some people in Texas, a woman in California, and several of these people have been elected to office. So it was cool seeing the process of them going from canvassing and doing their campaigns to actually being elected, and knowing, especially watching it now, knowing that some of these women have been in office for several years now, knowing what they've accomplished and what they continue to do for their communities. It was really cool and empowering. Also, one thing that was talked about a lot in the film was the disenfranchisement of people of color throughout the country. And so it really addressed, if anybody doesn't know that much about the state of Georgia, it really addressed everything that has gone on in Georgia in the last 4 years with Kemp and Abrams, and how they've thrown out literally thousands of registered voters for a variety of reasons, and how they've changed laws in Georgia in order to make it very difficult for people to vote, and how they closed polling places, and how polling places in some areas of the state, the machines don't work and everything goes wrong, whereas in other areas of the state everything's great. And it usually tends to be that in the areas where it's predominantly people of color, that those areas the machines all don't work. And
essentially they showed to give you a sense of context, they were showing people that were in the cities like Atlanta,
mm-hmm.
and those folks, there's all sorts of problems with the voting machines. There's all sorts of problems like lines around the block, and
there were people who had been standing in line for 7 hours. It's kind of like when we have our election here in Milwaukee, where we had people standing in line for hours because they shut down so many of the polling places.
Yeah, and then but to show the contrast, they then go to the predominantly white suburbs, and they ask people coming out of the polling place, and they're like, the whole process took me 2 minutes, and no problems at all.
Yeah.
And it's almost like they almost come off as incredulous
that people would think there was problems.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting because it actually followed some of the people who have been involved in activism in the state of Georgia, who are trying to start a movement throughout the country of getting more people registered to vote.
Yeah.
And so some of these groups are part of what people credit Ossoff and Warnock winning in Georgia, because there's been so much, even though they keep throwing out these thousands of votes, the activists have been pushing so hard, and it actually follows these groups of women who are coming from all over the country to the state of Georgia to help people register to vote.
Yeah.
And so all these people are banding together in order to help this happen. And so Georgia is one of the states where I believe they said within the next 3 years it's going to be the people of color in Georgia are going to outnumber the white people in Georgia.
Mm.
And so, but representation has not reflected that for a long time, and so they have been trying to get more people of color registered, and so it's Black groups working with Latino groups, working with Asian American groups,
yeah.
and all these different groups working together and reaching out to their communities and getting people who speak the various languages and can go out into the communities who are trustworthy to get people to register to vote. And then you've got a lot of it showed a lot of the volunteers who are driving people to the polling places so that they can vote because they're, the polling places are so far away. Or,
yeah, and part of the reason why they highlight they were highlighting the push and pull that happens because you have some politicians that want to purge the voter rolls and they want to do all of these things in order to cut down the number of voters. And then there are these grassroots groups that are like, no, we need to get the disenfranchised people out to vote. And it's this
clash,
massive push and pull. And they show a lot of people like going out canvassing and working class folks being like, yeah, I didn't plan on voting because what have any of these politicians ever done for me? And so there's a compounding aspect of becoming disenfranchised and then just electing to stay that way.
It also covered because it's called And She Could Be Next, and so it also covered a lot of like women's issues within voting as well. It was very interesting because it covered a lot of different things involved in politics and in the elections from the last few years.
Yeah, so. And it's a longer documentary. It was 2 DVDs.
Yeah, 2 DVDs, 2 parts, and it's like I think an hour and a half each. So we all told like a 3-hour documentary. But it was totally worth a watch. I highly recommend it. I learned a lot because I knew some of what was going on in Georgia, but I didn't know the extent of it, and I didn't know about the activist groups and stuff that were involved down there and what they've been doing as a state.
Yeah.
Not a state, but what the activists in the state have been doing to further their cause.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that's really important is it highlights how important activism is, because if it wasn't for these grassroots efforts, the disenfranchised would continue to be disenfranchised and the voter rolls would be purged, and the people that they managed to bring out to vote and to get re-signed up and all of these things, none of that would have been possible. And Georgia would have like the result that, even though this documentary takes place 2 years ago, what just took place in Georgia would have never been possible if things stayed the way they were and the activist groups did not get involved.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about Georgia, but like I said, it covers various states, so California, Michigan, Illinois, Texas. But yeah, so it covers several different states and it covers a lot of different information. And it also really drives home the point that, representation is very important, and that, we can't have people representing our country who don't necessarily look like the people who make up our country, because in order to understand what the people need, you need people who are like them involved in the political process.
Yeah, and the other very important thing is a lot of times political organizers make the mistake of going out and seeking out the existing voter base instead of going into communities of people that don't normally vote. And that was one of the things that was a big change in Georgia, was going into communities of people that don't normally vote and trying to convince them to vote. There's
yeah, like I remember there was a section on it in the documentary where they talked about the Asian Americans and how, because the Asian American population is so diverse in terms of the language that they speak and their customs and everything, that a lot of politicians don't bother to reach out to them. And so they had these groups of volunteers getting together, and they were distributing information in like Vietnamese and Chinese and all these different Korean, all these different Asian languages, and they were going around from house to house talking to people and explaining people's positions on issues. And that is not something that is normally done, because they mentioned that a lot of politicians think that even though they have these multi-million-dollar campaigns, they feel that the Asian population is so small that they're spending their money on materials to reach out to them is not worth their time.
It's a combination of the community being small, but also the amount of additional work, the investment of resources in order to reach out to that community, and it's a backwards way of thinking.
It is a backwards way of thinking, because it's like, just because a community is small doesn't mean that they should not be represented. I think that our government is founded on the idea that we should all have, supposedly, we should also have equal representation. But I think that we are moving in that direction, and hopefully, with these movements, we continue moving in that direction.
Yep.
So as promised, the documentary that Reggie Jackson has talked about in several of the series so far is, in several of the sessions, is Race, the Power of an Illusion, and that one is actually available through the Shorewood Library. You can request it. There's a few different copies in the system. And he's also mentioned a few other documentaries, but that's the main one that he talks about a lot. So if you're interested in, and you're not able to attend the sessions, you should give that one a watch.
And so I remember that Reggie Jackson also covered a bunch of stuff from a book having to do with the devaluation of black lives in medicine. What was that?
The book was called Medical Apartheid, and it was by Harriet Washington. The subtitle of that book is The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present. And in the last session, he shared several clips from interviews with her about the things that she covered in her book. And he also mentioned a few other books as well. So I believe we have some of the resources up on our website, but I will take a look this week, and on the next podcast I can share some of those resources because I do not have them in front of me right now.
Yep.
But it's well worth a watch if you can tune in for this next one. So, all right. So next week we will be doing Ready Player 2.
You couldn't see, but I held up two fingers to help.
Ernest Cline and Star Trek Discovery, the first. Did you watch the first two seasons?
The first two seasons
of Star Trek Discovery.
And how it made me want to flip over a car because I was so mad.
That's enough of that. All right, as always, you can find us on Spotify, Podbean, or iTunes. If you have any questions or comments for your host, please email us at shorewoodstacks@gmail.com, or you can comment on Podbean as well if you have the Podbean app. We hope you have enjoyed the show. Thanks for listening, and be well. The Shorewood Stacks is produced by Lisa Quintero and Nick Barron for the Shorewood Public Library. Music for the show is by Kevin MacLeod, and the song is called Ice Flow and can be found on incompetech.com.